Charlotte, remembered by history as Charlotte Stuart, Duchess of Albany, the only surviving child of Bonnie Prince Charlie, the last bloom of a dynasty in exile, and one of the most quietly remarkable women of the 18th century. She was born into a name that carried no country, a royal title with no kingdom behind it, and a father who could barely bring himself to acknowledge her. Raised in the hush of French convents, she grew up writing letters to a man who never wrote back, asking only for the smallest things: recognition, provision, the right to exist. For 27 years she waited. And then, when her father was old and broken and had nowhere else to turn, he finally called for her. She came, not with bitterness, but with love. She gave him her remaining years, and she gave him a peaceful death. But Charlotte's own secret, 3 hidden children raised under borrowed names, would not be uncovered for nearly 200 years. Tonight, we follow that journey from the very beginning. Good evening, and welcome back to Sleepy Crown Reborn. If you have only just subscribed, welcome to the family. And if you are returning to us again, welcome back home. It is a genuine pleasure to have you here with us tonight. Make yourself comfortable, lower the lights a little, and let the day gently fall away from you. Over the next few hours, we will share the calm, complete story of Charlotte Stuart, Duchess of Albany, an illegitimate princess born into the last embers of the Jacobite cause, raised in poverty and convent silence, kept invisible by the very father whose blood she carried, and yet possessed of a remarkable grace that would define the final years of one of history's most romantic dynasties. We will move softly through her hidden childhood, her long years of desperate letters, the secret life she maintained in parallel to her public one, and the quiet, devoted care she gave to a man who had failed her for the first 30 years of her existence, all told slowly and with care to help guide you toward restful sleep. And if you find a moment before you drift off, a gentle like and a quiet comment about which part of Charlotte's story moved you most tonight help keep these stories finding the people who need them. To understand Charlotte Stuart, we must first understand the world that made her, a world of candlelit palaces in foreign cities, of royal titles whispered in borrowed rooms, of an old and noble name kept warm across the generations by the heat of memory and belief. The story of Charlotte Stuart is inseparable from the story of the House of Stuart itself, and the House of Stuart is, above all things, a story of loss. Not a sudden or violent loss, but a slow and aching one. A long unraveling that stretched across decades and left its survivors stranded between who they once were and who the world would allow them to become. The beginning of this particular unraveling came in the autumn of 1688, when King James II of England, the 7th of Scotland, was removed from his throne in what history has come to call the Glorious Revolution. James was a Catholic king in a country that had grown profoundly suspicious of Catholicism, particularly in its monarchs. The long shadow of the English Reformation, the legacy of Mary Tudor's persecutions, the anxieties stirred by the reigns of Charles II and his openly Catholic brother and heir, all of these had combined to create a Protestant nation that would not willingly accept a Catholic succession. When the birth of a Catholic son and heir to James was announced in 1688, confirming that the dynasty would continue in the faith that England feared, a coalition of Protestant nobles sent a letter to William of Orange, the Dutch stadtholder and the husband of James's own Protestant daughter Mary, inviting him to come and restore what they called English liberties. William crossed the Channel with a substantial army and landed in Devon in November of 1688. James, faced with defections in his military and lacking the support he had anticipated, made the decision not to fight. He fled to France, and the throne was offered jointly to William and Mary. The glorious revolution accomplished with very little open conflict, almost as though England had decided to move on and expected no argument from the man it was removing. James never accepted that decision, and neither did his descendants. They regarded the revolution as an act of usurpation, a theft carried out under the cover of constitutional language, and they devoted their lives, their fortunes, and in many cases their freedom to the project of reversal. James settled in France initially under the protection of King Louis XIV, who recognized in the Stuart cause a useful instrument against his perennial enemy across the Channel. But after Louis's death and the diplomatic reshuffling that followed, James and the exiled court eventually relocated to Rome, where they were welcomed by a sympathetic papacy and housed in a grand palazzo on the Via del Corso, the Palazzo Muti, which the Church made available as a residence befitting his claimed status as the de jure King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. It was in this palazzo, in the heart of Catholic Europe, that the Stuart court in exile established itself, a court full of ceremony, protocol, and hope, surrounded always by the quiet knowledge that the power it claimed belonged to someone else. The court attracted a significant and devoted community of supporters, the Jacobites, as they were called, from the Latin Jacobus, for James. They came from England, Scotland, Ireland, and the European Catholic aristocracy that regarded the Stuart cause with sympathy and sometimes with active assistance. They brought with them the full apparatus of a functioning court, the investitures, the titles, the orders of chivalry, the careful precedences of rank, and maintained all of it in Rome with a devotion that might seem, from the outside, excessive or even deluded, but which made perfect sense from within. They were not performing futility. They were preserving a claim, keeping it warm, waiting for the moment when circumstances would allow it to be exercised. James Francis Edward Stuart, known to his enemies as the Old Pretender, known to his supporters as the rightful James III and VIII, was a quiet, pious man of considerable personal dignity and relatively limited political imagination. He prayed. He administered his small court. He received ambassadors and petitions and dispatched letters. He made his attempts at restoration. In 1715, when a rising in Scotland failed to press home its early advantages, and in 1719, when a Spanish-backed landing in the Western Highlands was defeated at Glenshiel, and each time the attempt failed, through a combination of poor coordination, insufficient French support, and the simple practical difficulties of mounting a campaign from exile. By the time he married, in 1719, he was already a man shaped by years of disappointment into something careful and wary, a man who had learned to hold his hopes loosely. His bride was Maria Clementina Sobieska, granddaughter of the celebrated John III of Poland. She was spirited, devout, and possessed of an energy that contrasted sharply with the subdued atmosphere that James's long exile had produced around him. Their marriage produced 2 sons. The elder, born on the last day of December in 1720, was given a magnificent cascade of names at his Roman baptism: Charles, Edward, Louis, John, Casimir, Sylvester, Severino, Maria. But the world would come to know him by something simpler and more vivid. History would call him the Young Pretender. Scotland would call him Bonnie Prince Charlie. His daughter Charlotte, the woman at the heart of tonight's story, would spend most of her life calling him Papa, in letters that very seldom received a reply. Charles grew up in the warm embrace of Jacobite expectation, and it suited his nature perfectly. He was handsome, energetic, and possessed of considerable natural charm, the kind of presence that fills a room and holds attention without effort. He absorbed the conviction from his earliest years that the British throne was not merely his birthright but his destiny, that the world was not yet as it should be, and that he was the instrument through which it would be set right. He studied military affairs with enthusiasm, demonstrated natural aptitude, and took his first real steps toward warfare at 13, accompanying his cousin to the siege of Gaeta in Naples, where he conducted himself under fire with a composure that impressed the experienced soldiers around him. He was a prince being prepared for a campaign, and in every visible way he was ready for it. The political moment arrived, as it does, in a convergence of opportunities. In the 1740s, England and France were once again at war as part of the broader conflict known as the War of the Austrian Succession, and the French court gave serious consideration to the possibility of using the Stuart pretender as a weapon. In 1744, a substantial French fleet assembled at Dunkirk, intended to carry Charles and an army across the Channel. A violent storm scattered the fleet and ended the enterprise before it could begin. But Charles was not a man who accepted what he found unacceptable. In the high summer of 1745, without a great French army, without official French backing, with very little more than personal determination and a small number of loyal companions, he landed on the western coast of Scotland to claim what he believed was his. What followed was one of the most extraordinary episodes in British military history. The Highland clans rallied to his standard with a speed and enthusiasm that exceeded even optimistic projections. He raised his banner at Glenfinnan in August. He defeated government forces at Prestonpans in September in barely 10 minutes of fighting, the Highland charge breaking the government line before it could properly form. He entered Edinburgh in triumph, held court at the palace of Holyrood House, and was received with a warmth that seemed to confirm everything the Jacobites had believed about the durability of the cause. Then came the push into England, south through Carlisle and Preston and Manchester to Derby, closer to London than any Jacobite army had ever reached. The capital was alarmed. The Bank of England paid its obligations in small coins to slow the drain on its reserves. The king was said to be preparing for flight. And then, at a council of war in Derby, on the 6th of December 1745, the generals called a halt. Lord George Murray and the other commanders argued that French reinforcements had not appeared, that English Jacobites had not risen in the numbers expected, that the army was deep in enemy territory and dangerously exposed. Charles argued fiercely against the retreat. He believed, and the argument has never been fully settled, that one more bold advance might have collapsed the resistance ahead of them. But he was overruled. The army turned north. The retreat began. A victory at Falkirk in January 1746 provided one last moment of hope, but by April the situation was desperate. The men were hungry, exhausted, and dispirited, and on the 16th of April 1746, on a flat moorland near Inverness called Culloden, the government forces under the Duke of Cumberland caught up with the Jacobite army and destroyed it. The battle lasted less than an hour. What followed was worse. Cumberland ordered no quarter, and his troops hunted down the wounded and the fleeing with systematic brutality. The Highlands were subject to punitive pacification in the months that followed. The clan system was dismantled. Jacobitism as a practical political force was ended. Charles survived and fled into the heather. For 5 extraordinary months, he was a fugitive, sheltered by people who could have claimed £30,000 in reward money and chose, every one of them, not to. He hid in caves, crossed to Skye disguised as Flora MacDonald's Irish maidservant, and in September 1746 finally escaped to France. He was 25 years old. He would never see Scotland again. But exile at 25 is a very different thing from exile at 40. The young prince who had come so close curdled, over the following years, into something harder and more bitter. He drank. He moved restlessly between cities, unable to settle, unable to accept the verdict of history. He had a scandalous affair with his married first cousin and abandoned her when she became pregnant. He was expelled from France in 1748, under pressure from Britain, and wandered to Avignon, to Lorraine, to various cities where he could hide his identity and nurse his disappointments. He became difficult, volatile, capable of violence. The brilliant prince of the 45 was becoming someone else entirely, a man in whom hope had curdled into grievance, and grievance into cruelty. It was in the midst of this troubled period that he reached out to Clementina Walkinshaw, the Scottish woman he had met at Bannockburn in January 1746. He sent money, and then he sent an emissary to invite her to come and live with him. She came, and in the autumn of 1753, Charlotte entered the world. The 5 months that Charles spent as a fugitive in the Scottish Highlands after Culloden deserve more than a brief mention, because they shaped the legend that his daughter would inherit, and that she would carry in the Jacobite imagination for the rest of her life. He was 25 years old, alone except for a small group of loyal companions who risked everything to protect him, and he was moving through a landscape of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary danger. The highland communities that sheltered him, the crofters and farmers and fishermen who gave him food and hiding and safe passage despite the £30,000 on his head, did so at real risk and received nothing for it. Their loyalty was not mercenary and not calculated. It was, in the fullest sense, a gift. Charles appears to have understood this, at least in these early months. The flight through the heather produced in him a genuine connection to the ordinary people of the Highlands that his later life would not always sustain. He ate their food, slept in their homes, wore their clothes. He crossed the Western Islands by boat in storms that would have tested experienced sailors. He spent nights in caves and days moving carefully through terrain that was being actively searched by government forces. The adventure, in all its genuine danger, was also in some ways the best version of what Charles could be. Courageous, adaptable, sustained by a physical and emotional toughness that his later years would bury under drink and bitterness. When he finally escaped to France, he carried with him a story that immediately became legend. The flight of the prince, the loyal Highlanders, Flora MacDonald, and her daring, the heather and the sea, was already being retold in ballads and poems before the year was out. It became the emotional core of the Jacobite cause, the thing that sustained the loyalty of supporters long after the political cause had ceased to be credible. It was the story that Charlotte grew up hearing about her father. It was the story that made the name she carried both magnificent and weighted. She was the daughter of that prince, the prince who had come so close, who had been sheltered by a loyal people, who had carried himself with grace in impossible circumstances. The shadow of that legend lay across everything Charlotte would ever do or be, shaping how others saw her and perhaps how she saw herself. The specific texture of Charles's exile in the years between 1746 and 1752, the years before Clementina joined him, the years in which he was becoming, without quite knowing it, the man who would damage everyone who came close to him, is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it explains something important about the father Charlotte would spend her life trying to reach. Charles had arrived in France from Scotland, carrying the emotional weight of what had happened at Culloden, and in the weeks that followed. And that weight did not lift. It settled, instead, into the structure of his personality and began to reshape it. He had believed, with his entire self, that the restoration was going to happen, that the will of a people and the justice of a cause were forces sufficient to overcome the practical obstacles. The lesson of Culloden was that they were not, and Charles was not constituted to absorb that lesson cleanly. He tried to believe that the failure was contingent rather than final, that a different decision at Derby, a stronger French commitment, a different disposition of forces on the moor would have produced a different outcome. This belief was not entirely unreasonable. Historians have debated the counterfactuals ever since, but sustaining it required a continuous act of will that consumed enormous psychological resources, and the resources that went into sustaining the belief were resources that were no longer available for processing the grief and the loss and the adjustment to changed circumstances that recovery required. Charles did not recover. He preserved instead, and what he preserved was the form of the conviction without the vitality that had originally powered it. The drinking was a symptom of this, as much as a cause. It was what happened when the preservation became too costly to maintain through will alone, when the exhaustion of sustaining the fiction of continued relevance became greater than the available willpower, and the gap was filled with something else. Charles drank because the world had not given him what he believed he deserved, and drinking was one available response to that experience, and over time it became the primary one. By the time Clementina came to live with him in 1752, the habit was deeply established. By the time Charlotte was born a year later, it was defining, and by the time Charlotte was old enough to understand what it meant, it had become the central fact of the household she was growing up in, the fact around which everything else organized itself. Clementina Walkinshaw was born around the year 1720. The precise date is disputed across the sources, with most placing it in the early 1720s, and she was the youngest of 10 daughters born to John Walkinshaw of Barrow Hill, a Glasgow merchant and committed Jacobite supporter. Her family was unusual in the landscape of 18th century Scottish society, prosperous enough to be considered gentry, educated, Catholic, and deeply committed to the Stuart cause in ways that had already cost the family something real. John Walkinshaw had fought for James Francis Edward Stuart in the Rising of 1715, been captured at the Battle of Sheriffmuir, escaped from Stirling Castle, and fled to the continent before eventually receiving a pardon and returning to Glasgow. He was a man who had put his freedom on the line for the Stuarts, and his daughters grew up knowing what that commitment looked like when it was tested. Clementina herself had been named after Clementina Sobieska, the Polish princess who became the wife of James Francis Edward Stuart and the mother of Charles Edward. This was not coincidence or sentiment alone. It was a deliberate statement of allegiance, the kind of gesture made by a family that intended its children to understand where their loyalties belonged. Clementina had been educated partly on the continent, had converted to Roman Catholicism, the faith of the Stuart court, and by the mid-1740s was living with her uncle, Sir Hugh Paterson, at Bannockburn House near Stirling. Sir Hugh was himself a prominent Jacobite, and his house was a natural gathering point for those loyal to the cause during the campaign of 1745. Charles came to Bannockburn House in the opening days of January 1746 on military business relating to the ongoing campaign, and he returned later that month when illness, what appears to have been a heavy cold or fever, required him to rest and be nursed. The women of the household attended to him during this period, and Clementina was among them. One account describes her providing him with cinnamon possets in the manner of the time, a small domestic detail, the image of a young woman sitting with a famous prince in a cold Scottish house, caring for him with the remedies available to her. It is, in its ordinariness, a more human picture of both of them than the legends usually provide. Whether they became lovers during those brief weeks at Bannockburn is something the sources disagree about. The relationship was clearly constrained by her uncle's presence and authority, and at least one source suggests that it was not yet intimate during the Bannockburn period itself. What is clear is that something passed between them that was not forgotten. not by Charles, who carried the memory with him through the catastrophe of Culloden and his 5 months of fugitive wandering, not by Clementina, who remained in Scotland and waited, and in 1752, when Charles heard she was at Dunkirk and struggling financially, the connection reasserted itself. He sent 50 gold louis and dispatched an emissary, a man named Sir Henry Goring, to invite her to Ghent. Goring was not enthusiastic. He complained, with a candour that his employer probably did not appreciate, about being employed in what he described in terms that are not printable in polite company, but which conveyed his opinion clearly enough. He described Clementina in unflattering terms and made his distaste for the errand plain. But he carried it out, and by November of 1752, Clementina was living with Charles in the arrangement that would constitute their relationship for the next 8 years. They moved to Liège, in what is now Belgium, and it was there that Charlotte was born on the 29th of October, 1753. She was baptized into the Roman Catholic faith in a Liège church. The precise church is given slightly differently in different sources, and the discrepancy is not worth dwelling on. And she entered the world as the only child that Charles Edward Stuart and Clementina Walkinshaw would ever produce together. She was his entire posterity. In the Jacobite reckoning, she was the person who would carry the blood of the Stuarts forward into whatever future remained to the dynasty. Charles received this fact with a kind of distracted indifference that set the tone for what followed. He referred to Charlotte, on the occasions when he referred to her at all, as ye cheild, the child, in the vague and dismissive way of a man for whom the domestic reality of fatherhood had not quite registered as something requiring active engagement. He was away from the household frequently, on the wanderings that took him away for weeks at a time. When he was present, his attention was absorbed by his grievances, by the drinking that had become a fixture of his daily life, and by the possessive and controlling behaviour toward Clementina that was beginning to make the household genuinely dangerous, because the situation in the Liège household was troubled from the beginning, and grew worse as the years passed. Charles had always had a difficult temperament, and the years since Culloden had not done it any good. He was a man who had expected extraordinary things from life and received, instead, a series of catastrophic reversals, and he was not processing those reversals with any grace or self-awareness. He drank heavily and with increasing regularity, and the alcohol made him volatile, made him cruel in ways that went beyond ordinary irritability. He was possessive of Clementina to a degree that went well beyond jealousy. He kept her under a form of domestic surveillance, suspicious of her movements and her communications, unwilling to allow her to maintain friendships or conduct her own affairs without his knowledge. The rumours that circulated in the Jacobite community, the whisper that Clementina was passing information about Charles's movements to the Hanoverian government, that she was, in effect, an enemy agent installed in his household, made everything worse. Whether these rumours had any foundation, in fact, has never been established. Most serious historians regard them with skepticism, noting that the evidence for actual espionage is thin, and that the accusations look more like the paranoid suspicions of a man under strain than documented intelligence about a real security breach. But Charles gave them partial credence at various points, and this added a layer of active suspicion to the possessiveness that was already making daily life suffocating. His representatives in other cities were recording the arguments and the rages and the increasingly public displays of an unhappy man and a woman at her limit. Charlotte grew up in the middle of all of this. She was too young to understand the political or personal dimensions of the situation, but she was not too young to feel its emotional texture, the unpredictability, the tension, the sense of a household organized around the moods of a father who could not be relied upon. She had no siblings, no extended community, no stability of place. The household moved frequently, following Charles's restless wandering, and Charlotte had no permanent home during the first 7 years of her life. She was growing up Catholic, learning her prayers and her catechism in French, absorbing the languages and customs of the European Catholic world in which the Stuart court moved. She was, by the accident of her birth, both highly significant and entirely powerless, the only offspring of a man who claimed 3 kingdoms, living in a series of rented rooms in foreign cities, with no legal standing and no certain future. By 1760, the family had come to rest in Basel. Charlotte was 6 years old, approaching 7. Clementina was somewhere in her late 30s or early 40s, and the decision that had perhaps been forming for years finally crystallized into action. Clementina had endured 8 years, 8 years of violence and poverty relative to what her birth should have offered her, 8 years of watching a man she had loved at Bannockburn become something frightening and diminished. She had, by 1760, done the calculation that people in genuinely dangerous situations eventually do. The costs of staying were higher than the costs of leaving. More than that, she had a daughter to consider. Charlotte was growing up in this environment, absorbing its instability and its fear, and Clementina understood that she was not protecting her daughter by remaining. She was only ensuring that Charlotte was damaged by what she was witnessing. She wrote to James Francis Edward Stuart in Rome and explained her situation with directness and dignity. James was sympathetic. He had his own concerns about his son's behavior, which had been an embarrassment to the cause for years, and he agreed to pay Clementina an annuity of 10,000 livres. There is evidence to suggest that James did more than simply provide money, that he actively assisted in the logistics of the escape, helping to arrange safe passage for Clementina and Charlotte from Basel to Paris. Whether or not the details of that assistance can be confirmed, what is certain is that in July of 1760, Clementina gathered what she and Charlotte needed and left. She left a letter for Charles. It was brief and dignified. She told him that she had been devoted to him, that she had stayed as long as she could, that 8 years of what she called repeated bad treatment had left her no choice, and that she was afraid for herself and for her daughter. She asked him to take care of Charlotte. Charles received the letter and erupted. He circulated descriptions of both Clementina and Charlotte, instructed those loyal to him to watch for them, sent angry communications to various parties. He described the departure as a theft, the theft of cheild. He was, in his own telling, a grieving father robbed of his daughter. The fact that he had barely acknowledged the daughter's existence until she was taken away from him appears not to have struck him as relevant. His pursuit came to nothing. They were already in Paris, already at the convent of the nuns of the Visitation, already on the other side of the door he was trying to force open. Charlotte was 7 years old. She would not see her father again for 24 years. The household that Charlotte was born into, while not without its moments of warmth, was shaped above all by the instability of Charles's emotional world. He had been, before Culloden, a man of enormous confidence and personal presence, someone whom people naturally followed, whose energy was infectious, whose certainty about his own destiny radiated outward into the people around him. The disaster of 1746 had not destroyed that capacity entirely, but it had bent it in directions that made it dangerous rather than inspiring. The certainty had become rigidity, the energy had become restlessness, and the confidence, stripped of the campaign and the cause that had given it legitimate outlet, had turned inward and soured into the kind of pride that cannot admit failure and therefore cannot address it. Clementina understood this. probably better than anyone else alive. She had chosen him, or been chosen. The distinction is not always clear in these arrangements. At a moment when he was still, at least in public, the bonny prince, the romantic hero of a romantic cause. By the time Charlotte was born, she knew the man behind the legend, and the man was considerably harder to live with than the legend had suggested. She managed as best she could. She was, by the accounts of those who knew her, a woman of considerable quiet strength, not dramatic, not confrontational, not prone to the kind of public scenes that would have been easy to produce given the circumstances. She bore what she had to bear, protected Charlotte where she could, and waited for the moment when leaving became possible. The child herself absorbed something of both her parents in ways that would not become fully visible until she was an adult. From her mother, she took the quiet strength, the capacity for patient endurance, the ability to manage difficult situations without losing herself in them. From her father, she took the physical presence, the dark colouring, and the particular kind of determined persistence that, in Charles, had manifested as proud obstinacy, but that in Charlotte would manifest as something considerably more admirable: the refusal, sustained over decades, to stop believing that the relationship she wanted with her father was worth continuing to ask for. It was, in the end, the same quality in both of them. The difference was what they applied it to. The years in Liège and the years of wandering that preceded them had given Charlotte one gift, at least, that she might not have received in more stable circumstances: fluency in the languages and cultures of continental Europe. She was growing up Catholic in French-speaking communities, in a world where the borders between nationalities were less fixed than the political map suggested, and where a person's identity was shaped less by where they had been born and more by the faith they practiced and the loyalties they maintained. This was the world of the Jacobite diaspora, a world defined by the accident of exile and by the stubborn maintenance of commitments that the world's practical arrangements no longer supported. Charlotte was, from her very first memories, a citizen of this world. Its languages were her languages, its assumptions were her assumptions, and its particular quality of dignified persistence in difficult circumstances, the quality that allowed people to maintain the forms of a royal court in a borrowed palazzo for a century, was hers from the beginning. The convent of the nuns of the Visitation in Paris was, in the context of 18th century French Catholic life, a place of considerable respectability and modest comfort. The Visitation order had been founded in the early 17th century by Saint Francis de Sales and Saint Jean de Chantal, and its particular character had been shaped from the beginning by an emphasis on gentleness and accessibility, rather than physical severity. It had been conceived, in fact, as a religious community specifically for women who could not manage the rigours of the more demanding contemplative orders, for women who needed the structure and the devotion of community life, but who required also some degree of accommodation to human fragility. Its convents were well regarded throughout France as places of genuine spiritual formation and decent education, and they were frequently used as residences by lay women who were not nuns themselves, but who lived within the convent walls for the protection, respectability, and ordered existence that such an arrangement provided. For Clementina, arriving with a young daughter and a modest income and a profound need for somewhere safe, the convent offered genuine refuge. The rhythms of religious community, the daily offices, the meal times, the schedule of prayer and work and recreation that divided each day into manageable portions, imposed a structure on life that was the exact opposite of the chaotic, violent, rootless existence she had been living with Charles. There was something to lean against here, something reliable and unchanging. The day began the same way and ended the same way, and the women around her were the same women tomorrow as they were today. She could breathe. She could begin to think about what a life outside Charles's orbit might actually look like. For Charlotte, the experience was different in kind, but not without its own consolations. She was young enough to adapt, old enough to notice what had changed. She had grown up knowing no permanent home. The household had moved repeatedly during her first 7 years, following Charles's wandering from Liège to Paris to Basel and various other stopping points. The convent gave her something she had not previously had: walls that stayed in the same place, neighbours who remained consistent from week to week, a school that was there every morning, whatever father-shaped absence she carried, and she was old enough to have one. The convent gave her the thing that absence had denied her: continuity. Her education proceeded in the formal manner appropriate to a girl of her background and the religious community in which she was being raised. She learned Latin, essential for the Mass, and for any meaningful engagement with the long tradition of Catholic learning that shaped the intellectual life of the institutions through which she passed. She learned French to a high degree of fluency and eventually of literary facility. It became her primary language, the tongue in which she thought and dreamed and wrote, more natural to her, probably, than the English that her father's family would technically have claimed as their own. She studied history, literature, and the other accomplishments considered appropriate for a young woman of her social position. She absorbed, as all children absorb the culture of the world they grow up in, the particular sensibilities of the French Catholic aristocratic milieu in which the visitation convents moved. A milieu of quiet faith, formal manners, and a deep sense of the obligations that rank and breeding imposed on those who possessed them. She was also, from a relatively young age, aware of the peculiarity of her situation. She understood that she was the daughter of Charles Edward Stuart, the famous prince, the man of the 45, the name that still inspired a kind of reverent sadness among the Jacobite community scattered across France and Catholic Europe. She understood that this name carried a great deal of weight. The weight came from the Stuart claim to the British throne, the claim that her grandfather maintained in Rome, and that would, on James's death, pass to her father. But the name also carried complexity. Charlotte was illegitimate. She had been born to an unmarried couple, in an unofficial arrangement, and in the legal and social framework of 18th century Europe, this mattered enormously and in ways that were not abstract. Illegitimacy constrained almost everything. Without legitimacy, Charlotte could not make the kind of marriage that her birth would otherwise have entitled her to expect. She could not be presented at courts, could not move freely in the social world, where her blood, technically, should have placed her. She could not, without her father's explicit consent, enter a religious order, which might have offered an alternative to marriage, a life of structured devotion within a community that provided its own kind of security. She was caught in a very precise trap, too well born to disappear into ordinary life, too stigmatized to take her place in the world that her blood suggested was hers by right. In 1766, the situation became considerably more precarious. On the 1st of January of that year, James Francis Edward Stuart died in Rome, at the age of 77. With him died the annuity of 10,000 livres that had sustained Clementina and Charlotte through 6 years of convent life. James had been, in the most practical sense, the person most consistently willing to provide for them, more willing than Cardinal Henry, far more willing than Charles himself. His death removed the most reliable support they had. Charles, who now styled himself King Charles III, continued his refusal to acknowledge any financial responsibility for his daughter and her mother. He was, in his own elaborate self-understanding, a king in exile, and kings had political and dynastic considerations that took precedence over the welfare of illegitimate children, or at any rate, that is what he appears to have believed or to have told himself. The letters he sent during this period spoke of his grief at Charlotte's absence, of how he missed cheild, of how the separation was a wound that had not healed, but he sent no money. The grief was real enough, perhaps. The provision was entirely absent, left without the pension from James and without any contribution from Charles. Clementina, who had by this point taken to styling herself the Countess of Albany, a small dignity she maintained as a matter of social self-preservation, appealed to Cardinal Henry for assistance. Henry was in Rome, occupied with his ecclesiastical duties and the management of the small Stuart court in exile. He was a cold man by temperament, precise and legalistic in his dealings, capable of kindness, but not naturally warm. He agreed to provide an allowance of 5,000 livres per year, exactly half of what James had been paying. But the condition he attached revealed something important about his priorities. In exchange for the money, he required Clementina to sign a formal statement affirming that she had never been married to Charles. The legal significance of this statement was real. It removed any residual argument that Charlotte might one day claim legitimacy through a secret marriage between her parents, and it closed off a line of dynastic complication that Henry found troubling. Clementina signed it because she had no real choice, and then, later, when circumstances allowed, she attempted to retract it, a gesture that suggests very clearly that the signature had been extracted under duress rather than given with any genuine freedom. Charlotte was approaching her teens now. She was entering the phase of her life when the shape of the trap she was in would have been becoming clearer and more impossible to ignore. She was bright enough to understand her situation precisely. She was old enough to feel the weight of what it meant. She was beginning to understand that if anything was going to change, it would have to be because her father changed his position, because he chose, at some point, to acknowledge what he had produced and take some responsibility for it. And she was beginning, in these years, to write to him, not yet with the urgency that the later letters would carry, but persistently and carefully, with the measured hope of someone who had not yet entirely given up on persuasion. He did not reply, or he replied with silence, which is its own kind of reply. But Charlotte went on writing. 100 letters a year, eventually. Some sources give this figure for the later period of her Italian residence, but the habit of determined correspondence appears to have developed early. She was building, in the absence of any other available tool, a relationship out of words on paper, a connection maintained across silence and refusal and the widening distance of years. It was not rational, perhaps. The evidence of the first 12 years did not support hope. But Charlotte was not a woman who abandoned commitments because they were difficult. That quality, visible here in her teens, would define everything that came afterward. The education Charlotte received in the French convents was, by the standards of the time and the community she was part of, a genuinely good one. The visitation order placed considerable emphasis on the formation of the intellect as well as the devotion of the heart, and the schools attached to its convents produced women who were capable of navigating the intellectual life of their era with some confidence. Charlotte would have been trained in the formal arts of written expression, the skill of composing a letter, of presenting an argument, of maintaining the register appropriate to the person one was addressing. This training was not merely ornamental, it was practical, in the specific sense that written communication was the primary medium through which business and personal relations were conducted in the world she moved in, and the ability to write well, clearly, persuasively, with the right combination of deference and directness, was a genuinely valuable skill. The letters she produced throughout her adult life are evidence that she developed this skill to a high degree. The surviving correspondence, the letters to her father, the letters to her mother, the letters that eventually revealed the secret of her children, shows a woman who understood how to use language strategically, who could calibrate the emotional register of what she was writing with considerable precision. She knew when to be formal and when to allow feeling through, when to make a demand and when to make a request, when to emphasize her vulnerability and when to present her strength. These are not instinctive skills, they are learned ones. And the French convent schools, for all the limitations of the life they offered, gave Charlotte the tools she needed to conduct the long, patient campaign of her relationship with her father. The physical world of the convent was also, in its way, forming her. The enclosed garden, the regular hours, the silence that was punctuated by bells. These were not merely the trappings of religious devotion. They were a way of life that taught a particular relationship to time. In the convent, time was not something to be rushed through or escaped from. It was something to be inhabited, to be lived through carefully and fully, in the belief that even the quiet and unremarkable day had its purpose within a larger design. Charlotte had a great deal of quiet and unremarkable time during those 24 convent years. She learned to live in it without losing herself to despair or impatience. This capacity to sustain hope across long silences, to maintain the orientation toward a future that was not yet visible, would serve her in ways that the convent probably never imagined it was teaching. The years between 1766 and 1772 have a particular quality in Charlotte's story, a quality of suspension, of time that passes without producing the things that make time feel meaningful. She was moving through her teenage years and into her early 20s, and the outer shape of her existence remained essentially unchanged. The convent, the prayers, the careful management of limited funds, the letters to a father who answered with silence. She was writing to him with a regularity that speaks to something stubborn and enduring in her character. A refusal to accept that silence was the final answer. A conviction that persistence, properly applied, would eventually produce a result. What she was asking for was not extravagant. She asked to be legitimized, to have her father sign a formal document acknowledging her as his daughter and removing the legal stigma of her illegitimate birth. She asked to be provided for financially, to have some arrangement made that would relieve her and her mother from their dependence on Cardinal Henry's reluctant charity. She asked to be allowed to exist in the world in some recognized and sustainable way, to marry, or to take religious vows, or to do something with her life that would give it the shape and purpose that her current situation denied her. And she asked, always, with careful respect and appropriate deference, as someone who understood that her claims on her father's attention were legally weak and personally complicated. None of these requests were fulfilled. Charles was in Rome, maintaining the forms of a royal court in the Palazzo Muti, with a dedication that required admiring for its sheer tenacity, even if the substance behind the forms had long since evaporated. He held audiences. He signed documents with the royal style. He received a small number of Jacobite loyalists who still came to pay their respects. He had portraits made of himself in the manner of a reigning king. He corresponded with sympathizers across Europe in language that assumed the restoration of the Stuarts to be not merely possible, but imminent. And through all of this, Charlotte's letters arrived and were set aside. Pope Clement XIII had declined to recognize Charles's royal title in 1766, following James's death, a significant blow since the papacy's acknowledgement was one of the few forms of legitimacy still practically available to him. Clement's refusal was followed by that of his successor Clement XIV, and by the time of Pius VI, the position of the Holy See had become a settled refusal. The courts of Europe had long since ceased to treat the Stuart Restoration as a serious political possibility. The French, the Spanish, the Habsburgs, all of whom had at various points been useful allies or active supporters of the Jacobite cause, had moved on to other interests. Charles was, in the Roman of the 1760s, maintaining a claim that almost no one with power took seriously, in a city that watched him with a mixture of sympathy and amusement. Into this world of maintained illusions and quiet irrelevance, Charlotte's letters arrived and were set aside. It is possible, the evidence suggests it is even probable, that Charles felt genuine conflict about his daughter's situation. He referred to her in private correspondence in ways that suggest he thought about her, missed her in some complicated way, wished things had gone differently. But feeling without action was of very limited use to Charlotte, who needed not his private grief, but his public acknowledgement, not his unexpressed regrets, but his signature on a legal document. And the gap between the two, between what he felt and what he was prepared to do, remained, year after year, as wide as the distance between France and Rome. The court at the Palazzo Muti was, by the late 1760s, a somewhat melancholy institution. Visitors described an aging man in rooms that had the feel of a very long vigil, rooms full of the markers of royal ceremony that had come to seem, to eyes not already committed to the fiction, more sad than impressive. Charles was drinking heavily. The strokes that would eventually kill him appeared to have been beginning. There were episodes of sudden incapacity, of clouded thinking, of an unsteadiness in his bearing that was more than simply the effect of drink. He was, at 50 and beyond, paying the accumulated costs of a life lived under sustained pressure and sustained self-medication, and the bills were becoming visible. In 1772, the situation crystallized into something more urgent for Charlotte. Charles, now 51, and conscious that his health was declining, and that he had so far produced no heir who could continue the Stuart claim in any legitimate form, entered into a marriage. The bride was Princess Louise of Stolberg-Gaden, a young German princess of 19, educated, cultured, and possessed of a genuine intellectual vitality that her new husband had long since abandoned. She was only a year older than Charlotte herself. The marriage was arranged through diplomatic channels and presented as what the Jacobite cause required, a last attempt to produce a legitimate heir who might carry the claim forward into another generation. For Charlotte, the implications were clear and alarming. If Louise produced a son, a legitimate son, Charlotte's already tenuous position would become still more precarious. She would be superseded, pushed further into irrelevance by the birth of a child who bore none of the stigma she had carried all her life. The moment that had been indefinitely deferred would be indefinitely removed. Whatever fragile hope she had sustained through 12 years of writing would dissolve. In April of 1772, Charlotte sat down and wrote what would become perhaps the most famous of all her letters to her father. She addressed him, as she always did, as Mon Auguste Papa, my august father, and she made her case with a clarity that was new in the correspondence, the urgency that the changed situation had introduced, breaking through the careful formality she had always maintained. She asked to be legitimized. She asked to be provided for. She asked to be brought to Rome before a legitimate heir could be born, who would foreclose her options entirely. The letter reached Charles through the good offices of Principal Gordon of the Scots College in Rome, a reliable intermediary in the Jacobite network. This time Charles responded. He wrote back to say that he was willing to make some arrangement, that he would consider bringing Charlotte to Rome, that he was open to the question of her situation being addressed, but there was a condition. She would have to come alone. She would have to leave her mother behind in France. Charlotte refused. It is, in retrospect, one of the most revealing moments in her story. She had spent 12 years writing to this man. She had been living in genuine poverty, dependent on grudging charity, waiting for the acknowledgement that was her right. And now the acknowledgement was being offered, but on a condition that required her to abandon the one person who had never abandoned her. Clementina had fled a violent man in order to protect her daughter. Clementina had endured poverty and social obscurity and Henry's legal maneuverings in order to remain present for Charlotte. And now Charlotte was being asked to leave her behind as the price of admission to the family she had been kept out of for 12 years. She could not do it. She wrote back and said so. Charles, for whom this refusal registered as yet another act of misplaced loyalty, loyalty to the wrong person, withdrew and returned to silence. And so, towards the end of 1772, Charlotte and Clementina made a decision that was either very brave or very desperate, or quite probably both. They travelled to Rome, without invitation, without permission, without any arrangement in place, to make their appeal in person. They arrived at the Palazzo Muti and presented themselves. Charles refused to receive them. He refused to open the door. He refused even to send a message acknowledging that his daughter was standing outside the building he lived in. They waited, and then they turned around and made the long journey back to France. Charlotte was 19 years old. She would wait another 11 years before anything changed, and in those 11 years she would build a life that no one, including her father, knew anything about. There is something that needs to be said about the quality of Charlotte's patience during these years, because patience is not a passive quality, and Charlotte's was not passive. It was active, strategic, and maintained at considerable personal cost. She was not simply waiting, she was working. Every letter she wrote was an act of maintenance, of keeping a connection alive that had never properly been formed, and that would, without her persistent attention, have simply dissolved. She was building a relationship with materials that barely existed, on foundations that had never been properly laid, and she was doing it in the knowledge that at any moment the person on the other end might simply stop acknowledging that the material was there. The French convent world in which she was living was, in its way, a training ground for exactly this kind of work. The contemplative life, even for lay residents who were not formally taking vows, developed particular capacities in the people who lived within it. It developed the capacity to sustain an orientation over long periods of unremarkable time. It developed the capacity to find meaning in small gestures and small consistencies, rather than requiring the large, dramatic confirmations that more active lives might provide. And it developed, perhaps above all, the capacity to continue in a chosen direction when the evidence for continuing was thin and the evidence for giving up was substantial. Charlotte had been living in this training ground since she was 7 years old. Whatever it took from her in terms of freedom and opportunity, it gave her, in return, the quality that her situation most required. She was also, in these years, not entirely without the consolations of ordinary social life. The convents she and Clementina moved through were communities, and communities have their rhythms of friendship and conversation and shared experience, however constrained the framework in which they occur. Charlotte would have had companions, women of her own age and background who were also navigating difficult situations within the same institutional context. She would have had teachers and spiritual directors who provided guidance and sometimes genuine intellectual stimulation. She would have had the life of the mind that her education had opened to her, The books, the letters, the engagement with ideas that was possible even within enclosed circumstances, particularly for someone with Charlotte's intelligence, and her access to the networks of Jacobite correspondence that circulated through the French Catholic world. The Jacobite network was, in its way, a form of community that supplemented the physical community of the convents. There were other families in similar situations, other women of Stuart blood or Jacobite connection, who were navigating the particular difficulties that the exile and the cause had created. Charlotte was not unique in her situation, though she was perhaps unusual in the specific combination of her father's famous name and her own illegitimate status. These connections, through the Scots College in Rome, through the various intermediaries who carried correspondence between the exiled communities, through the priests and merchants and minor diplomats who maintained the Stuart network across Europe, gave Charlotte access to a wider world than her immediate circumstances might have suggested. She was, even in the convents, connected. The years that followed the failed Rome visit were defined by a particular quality of entrapment that Charlotte cannot have failed to feel acutely. She was in her early 20s now, and the shape of her situation had become difficult to reframe in any hopeful direction. She was the illegitimate daughter of a man who would not acknowledge her. She could not marry without his consent, and his consent was not available. She could not take religious vows. Formal entry into a religious order required parental permission as well. And the answer there was the same silence that met all her other requests. She was supported, inadequately and resentfully, by a cardinal uncle who had made his conditions clear, and she was watching from France as her father settled into his new marriage, and the Jacobite court reorganized itself around the possibility, remote but officially maintained, of a legitimate heir. Louise of Stolberg-Gaydon was, by most contemporary accounts, a considerably more impressive person than the man she had married. She was fluent in several languages. She was genuinely interested in literature, philosophy, and the ideas circulating in the Enlightenment salons of French and Italian aristocratic life. She was, in a phrase common to several accounts of her, vivacious, a word that implies the kind of social energy that Charles, by the 1770s, had comprehensively lost. She would eventually become the companion of Vittorio Alfieri, one of the significant figures of Italian Romantic literature, and in that relationship she would find something she had clearly never had with Charles, an intellectual equal, a man who could meet her mind. But in the years immediately following the marriage, she was doing what new wives of difficult husbands frequently do, working to make the best of something that had not turned out to be what she expected. Charles had not improved. The drinking that had defined his life since the 1750s had continued and deepened, and his health was beginning to show the long-term consequences of decades of heavy consumption. His temper had not mellowed with age. His domestic behavior toward Louise, who was young enough, as Charlotte was to have been his daughter, appears to have reproduced at least some of the patterns that had characterized his relationship with Clementina. There were arguments. There was, according to some accounts, violence, and Louise, unlike Clementina, had social resources and powerful connections that ultimately gave her the ability to leave on her own terms. The marriage produced no children. Whatever dynastic purpose had been invested in it, the hope of a legitimate heir to carry the claim forward, was disappointed. By the late 1770s, the union had effectively ended in all but legal form, Louise making no secret of her relationship with Alfieri, who was by then her constant companion. By 1784, a formal separation was in place. Charles was alone in Florence, aging and increasingly unwell, in a city that received him with polite indifference. Meanwhile, Charlotte's own health had begun to send signals that she could not ignore. Around 1775, she started to experience symptoms of the liver condition that would eventually kill her. Fatigue, intermittent pain, the kind of persistent physical unease that signals something systemic rather than something passing. The condition appears to have been a susceptibility that ran through the Stuart family, darkening several of its branches in the 18th century, and Charlotte was among those who carried it. She was in her mid-20s, and she was not well. She managed the symptoms as best she could, with the limited medical tools available to her, and she said little about them to anyone who did not need to know. But the illness, combined with the financial insecurity and the social isolation, and the knowledge that her father's marriage might at any moment produce a legitimate heir who would foreclose her situation permanently, all of these pressures together created a moment of decision. Charlotte could not marry. She had no legitimate status, no paternal consent, and no realistic prospect of obtaining either in the foreseeable future. No family of rank would accept an illegitimate daughter of an unrecognized pretender without the express support of the pretender himself, and Charles showed no inclination to provide that support. But she could seek the kind of protection that many women in her position had found in the European aristocratic world of the period, a relationship with a man of power and discretion who could offer her stability and provision without the legal framework of marriage, a relationship that worked because both parties had reasons to keep it quiet and both parties had something to gain from it. The man she found, the man who would become her companion, the father of her children, and the keeper of her greatest secret, was Ferdinand Maximilien Mériadec de Rohan, Archbishop of Bordeaux. Ferdinand had been born in Paris in November of 1738, the son of the Prince of Guémené, one of the most powerful families in France. The Rohans were ancient Breton nobility, enormously wealthy, with connections reaching into every important corner of French Catholic aristocratic life. They had a saying about themselves that captured their self-regard perfectly. King I cannot be, Prince I disdain to be, Rohan I am. They were, in their own estimation, a category unto themselves, not quite royal, but very nearly, and very conscious of it. Ferdinand was a younger son, which in the social logic of the period meant the Church, and the Church had given him a career of corresponding magnitude. He was Archbishop of Bordeaux from 1771, a position of great prestige and substantial revenue, and he was elevated to Archbishop of Cambrai in 1781, one of the most distinguished ecclesiastical appointments in France. He was also connected by blood, at several removes, to the House of Stuart, to the Bourbon, and to the House of Lorraine. The Catholic aristocracy of 18th century Europe was deeply interconnected, its great families related by the accumulated marriages of generations, and the Rohans were among the most interconnected of all. The thread that ran between Ferdinand and Charlotte was not a close one, but it was real, and for those who cared about such things, and in the world of Jacobite loyalists and dynastic consciousness, people did care about such things. It gave the relationship a kind of significance that went beyond the personal. Ferdinand could not marry. His celibacy was a formal commitment of his vocation, and whatever private accommodations the French Catholic hierarchy of the period permitted its senior figures, and it permitted rather more than a strict reading of canon law would have sanctioned, any such arrangement had to be managed with a discretion that bordered on invisibility. A public acknowledgement of a relationship would have been professionally and personally devastating. Charlotte could not marry. She had no paternal consent and no legal standing. In this precise and unhappy way, their constraints matched. They came together at some point in the mid to late 1770s. The details of how and when the relationship began are not in any surviving record. What we know is that by the early 1780s, Charlotte and Ferdinand had been together long enough to produce children, and that those children were being hidden with a thoroughness that is, in retrospect, extraordinary. The first to arrive appeared to have been two daughters. The elder, Charlotte Maximilienne Amélie, was probably born around 1780. The second daughter, known in some records as Victoire Adelaide, in others as Marie Victoire, appears to have arrived somewhere in the years between 1779 and 1783. The scholarly debate about the precise identity and birth dates of Charlotte's daughters has not been settled, and the confusion itself reflects how thoroughly Charlotte concealed what was happening. And then, on the 13th of May, 1784, in the parish church of Saint-Méry in Paris, a son was baptized. The register recorded him as the son of Maximilian Ruhenstadt and his wife Clementine Ruthven. Neither of those people existed outside that baptismal record. The child was given the names Charles Edward Augustus Maximilian, a selection that encoded his real parentage for anyone who knew how to read it. Charles Edward for his grandfather, Augustus Maximilian for the Rohan line, and the name Ruhenstadt, the fictional father's surname, was itself a hidden declaration. Rohan and Stuart, compressed into a single word, the two family lines of a child whose actual parents could not acknowledge him. Charlotte kept this secret absolutely. Not even her father, who believed himself to be a king without a kingdom, knew that he had grandchildren growing up in Paris under assumed names. The last of the Stuart grandchildren were being raised in deliberate anonymity, while their grandfather sat in Florence, convinced that his line would end with him. The irony of this is not small, and the skill required to maintain the secret, to manage 3 pregnancies, 3 births, 3 hidden children in the society of the French convent world, without attracting sufficient attention to break the concealment, reflects a quality of determination and practical intelligence in Charlotte that the romantic legend of her story tends to obscure. She wrote to her mother constantly. Clementina was necessarily part of the secret, since she would eventually become the primary caretaker of the children. Charlotte's letters to her mother, in the period covered by the secret children, were careful and indirect. They referenced the children without naming them as such, used the language of concern and provision that a mother might use, while covering the tracks that a spy would also cover. When these letters were eventually found in the 20th century, it took patient reading to extract from them the shape of what Charlotte was managing. But the shape was there, if you knew to look for it. She worried constantly about the children's welfare. She worried about Ferdinand's constancy. She worried about her mother's aging and her capacity to manage. She worried, above everything, that she would not have the time she needed to make proper provision before her own health gave out entirely. The premonitory quality of that worry would prove, in the end, entirely justified. The France of the 1770s, the world Charlotte was living in during these years, was itself in the early stages of the transformation that would eventually produce the revolution. The Ancien Régime, the elaborate structure of privilege, precedence, and inherited status that organized French society, was still intact, but the intellectual atmosphere was increasingly charged with the Enlightenment ideas that were questioning its foundations. Charlotte was not, as far as we can tell, a political thinker in any systematic way. Her concerns were personal and immediate rather than philosophical. But she was living in a world where the air was full of arguments about legitimacy and the rights of individuals, about the obligations of rulers and the entitlements of the ruled, and these arguments cannot have been entirely irrelevant to a woman whose own situation was so thoroughly defined by the questions of who had the right to what and why. The convents that had sheltered Charlotte and Clementina for so many years were themselves, in a sense, emblems of the old order, institutions maintained by religious communities that depended on the patronage and protection of the aristocratic Catholic families who provided their funding and their social standing. Charlotte's position within these communities, as the acknowledged, if unofficial, daughter of a famous Jacobite pretender, gave her a social status that was simultaneously elevated and precarious. She was too important to be ignored and too irregular to be fully included. She moved in a world that knew how to manage these situations, that had centuries of experience with the irregular positions of royal and noble women who could not be publicly acknowledged, and that provided a kind of shelter precisely for people whose status was too complicated to be handled by the official structures. What Charlotte's situation required, in the end, was not a change in the social structures around her, but a change in the private decision of one man, her father. Everything depended on him, his signature on a legitimization document, his formal acknowledgement of her existence, his provision of the financial support that would allow her to live with some security. These were the things that would change her situation, and he alone had the power to provide them. She could write letters, she could make requests, she could appeal to intermediaries, but she could not act for herself in the way that would make the difference. The trap was not structural, it was personal, and that, in some ways, made it harder to endure, because the solution was always visible, always a single decision away, always dependent on a man who had chosen, for his own complicated reasons, to keep the door closed. In 1783, the long silence from Rome finally broke, not with a word, but with a legal document. Charles's marriage to Louise had by this point effectively ended. She had been living separately from him for some time, her relationship with the poet Alfieri an open fact in the European social world that Charles moved in. There was no longer any realistic prospect of a legitimate heir from the marriage, and Charles, now 62 and increasingly unwell, had arrived at the place where a man sometimes arrives when the defences he has maintained for years against uncomfortable truths begin to cost more than they are worth. His daughter was in France. She had been there for 23 years. He had ignored her for most of that time. And now, without a legitimate heir, without a wife, without the robust health that had once sustained his sense that the future was still full of possibility, he reconsidered. In March of 1783, Charles made two significant decisions. He revised his will to name Charlotte as his principal heir, the person who would receive the greatest portion of what remained of the Stuart estate after his debts and other obligations had been met, and he signed a formal act of legitimization. The document acknowledged Charlotte as his natural daughter and invested her with the right of succession to his private estate and to whatever remained of the Stuart dynastic claims. It was sent to King Louis XVI of France for registration with the Parliament of Paris, the necessary step for it to have legal force under French law. Cardinal Henry contested the act almost immediately. He raised procedural and legal objections, arguing that the legitimization was irregular in its form and created difficulties in the question of the Stuart succession, a succession that, by any practical assessment, had long since ceased to have political relevance, but which Henry regarded with a seriousness that never wavered. His objections were not entirely without legal substance, and they succeeded in delaying the formal registration of the Act for over 4 years. It was not until September of 1787 that Louis XVI formally confirmed and registered the document, but the moral significance of what Charles had done was immediate and real. Charlotte knew she had been acknowledged at last, in the way she had spent 23 years asking for. And then, in July of 1784, following the legal formalization of his separation from Louise, Charles wrote to Charlotte again. He addressed her as ma chère fille, my dear daughter, and he invited her to come to him in Florence. No conditions this time, no requirement that she abandon her mother, simply an invitation, offered in the language of a father who wished to see his child. Charlotte moved quickly. The children, the youngest only 2 months old when she left Paris, were settled into Clementina's care. Whatever arrangement Charlotte made with Ferdinand regarding the ongoing support and protection of the children and their grandmother, it was sufficient for the immediate situation, and Charlotte packed what she needed, said whatever she said to the people she was leaving behind, and set out for Florence. She arrived on the 5th of October, 1784. She was 30 years old. She had not seen her father since she was 7. Whatever she had imagined, and she had had 23 years to imagine it, the reality was almost certainly not what she expected. The man she found was not the romantic prince of the 45, not the brilliant, dangerous young heir who had led an army to Derby and almost changed British history. He was 63 years old and looked older. He had suffered what appears to have been a significant stroke in the years before Charlotte's arrival, and the effects were visible. His movement was impaired, his speech sometimes unclear, his thinking cloudier than it had once been. He was using a litter to travel, carried from room to room and between residences rather than walking. The physical confidence and energy that had always been among his most notable qualities were gone. He was also, despite the decades of damage, still capable of genuine warmth toward the daughter he had ignored for so long. The record suggests that the reunion, for all its complications, contained real feeling on both sides. A father who had spent 23 years describing his grief over the loss of cheild, and a daughter who had spent the same period asking for recognition she had not received, and who had, remarkably, held enough love in reserve to bring it to this meeting. Charlotte, looking at the broken and aging man in front of her, made her choice. She was going to be his daughter, not perform the role, not hold herself at careful distance, not exact any of the emotional repayments that 23 years of rejection might have seemed to entitle her to. She was going to actually do it. In November of 1784, Charles installed Charlotte at the Palazzo Guadagni in Florence and formally created her Duchess of Albany in the Jacobite peerage. He styled her Her Royal Highness, a title that had no legal standing in Britain, recognized by only a handful of European authorities, but deeply meaningful to Charlotte as the formal acknowledgement she had been asking for since she could write. Pope Pius VI, when informed, welcomed Charlotte's title, a recognition that carried genuine weight in the world of European Catholic aristocracy. Charles went further in his gestures of acknowledgement, and it is in these gestures that the emotional quality of his late relationship with Charlotte becomes most visible. On the 30th of November, 1784, the feast of St. Andrew, patron saint of Scotland, he held a state banquet in Charlotte's honour and invested her with the Order of the Thistle, the Scottish order of chivalry that the Exile Stuarts had continued to bestow. He had medals struck bearing her image with the Latin motto Spes tamen est una, there is one hope. He commissioned formal portraits from artists of distinction. Gavin Hamilton drew her in chalk in the neoclassical manner, and Hugh Douglas Hamilton painted her in a tiara, dignified and assured, the acknowledged daughter of a man who still called himself a king. And he permitted Charlotte to wear the Sobieska jewellery, the heirlooms that had come through his mother's Polish royal line, the most beautiful and tangible material remnant of what the Stuart dynasty had once been. The portrait that Hamilton painted gives us our best physical description of Charlotte at 30. She was tall, with a dark complexion, and what one contemporary visitor described as a masculine boldness of bearing, by which the visitor meant, in the language of the period, a presence and directness that exceeded what was conventionally expected of women. She was not a fragile or decorative figure. She was physically substantial, energetic in her manner, possessed of a vitality that her father had once had and had long since lost. She managed the Florentine household with evident competence, handled the correspondence, organized social engagements for Charles, and introduced him to the Florentine nobility, who might otherwise have found little reason to visit the residence of an elderly pretender whose claim to the throne was officially fictional. She also worked, with a patience and a tact that the sources consistently note, on the question of his drinking. It was a delicate task, because Charles had been drinking heavily for 30 years and did not respond well to having this pointed out. But Charlotte had time, and she had something that she had been building. In those years of writing letters, in those years of learning to manage difficult situations without resources, she had the skill to approach a proud and resistant man in ways that did not trigger his defenses. She made progress, not a transformation, but a measurable reduction in the volume of his consumption, and a corresponding improvement in the quality of his daily existence. And she wrote to her mother, 100 letters a year by one account, which is a remarkable figure, a figure that speaks to how much of Charlotte's inner life was still oriented toward Paris, toward the people she had left behind, toward the children she could not name, and the mother she was worried about. She asked repeatedly whether there was any possibility of Clementina coming to Florence. Charles consistently said no. She worried about Ferdinand's constancy. The Archbishop of Cambrai was a busy and powerful man, and his attention was not guaranteed to remain fixed on the arrangement they had maintained through her absence. She worried about her children, growing up in Paris without her, in the care of an aging grandmother who had already spent 30 years absorbing the costs of other people's decisions. But she was here, in Florence, in the presence of her father. And that, after everything, was something. The Act of Legitimization that Charles signed in March of 1783 was a document of considerable symbolic weight, whatever its legal complications. For over 20 years, Charlotte had been asking for this exact thing, a formal acknowledgement, signed by her father, confirming that she was his daughter and that she had rights that derived from that relationship. The document could not give her back the years she had lost. It could not undo the rejections, the silences, the Rome visit that had ended with the door not opening. But it was real in its own right, and it changed the terms of Charlotte's existence in ways that were immediately tangible. She could now call herself, with legal grounding at least in the Jacobite world, the daughter of Charles III. She had a claim to his estate. She had, in the language of the document, been recognized. The word that had been denied her for the first 3 decades of her life. Henry's contestation of the act was a reminder that even now the recognition was disputed, that even the small dignity of being acknowledged was something that could be fought over by men with legal arguments and institutional power. But the contestation itself demonstrated that the act was real enough to be worth fighting about. You do not contest something that doesn't exist. The years between 1783 and 1784, between the signing of the act and Charlotte's arrival in Florence, were years of correspondence that had a different quality from anything that had come before. Charles and Charlotte were now writing to each other not as a petitioner, writing to a powerful man who might or might not choose to respond, but as acknowledged relatives working out the terms of a relationship that was finally going to exist in the open. The letters from this period are warmer in tone, more direct, more willing to speak to personal matters rather than only to formal requests. Charles addressed her as his daughter. She addressed him as her father. The 23-year silence was over. What is remarkable about Charlotte's response to all of this, to the legitimization, to the invitation, to the eventual arrival in Florence is the absence of recrimination. She did not make Charles feel her anger, if she felt it. She did not present him with an accounting of what she had suffered or demand acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done to her. She arrived in Florence and was a daughter, present, warm, practically engaged. The restraint this required is easy to underestimate. Charlotte had been treated very badly, over a very long time, by a man whose capacity for self-justification was considerable and whose capacity for remorse was uncertain. She had every reason to be difficult. She chose not to be. She chose instead to give him the years she had left, and to give them generously. The months between her arrival in Florence in October 1784 and the move to Rome in December 1785 were also the months in which Charlotte began to develop the social life of the Florentine exile court in ways that had not been possible before her arrival. Charles's isolation in Florence had been considerable. A sick old man in an unfamiliar city, without the connections or the energy to maintain the kind of social world that gave the court its continued relevance. Charlotte changed this. She was energetic, well connected by the standards of the European Catholic aristocracy in which she had grown up, and possessed of the social intelligence to navigate the Florentine nobility with skill. She brought people to the house. She attended events. She made the court visible again, in a modest way, in a city that had largely forgotten it existed, and she did all of this while simultaneously managing her father's medical needs, maintaining her correspondence with her mother in Paris, and continuing to handle the complicated business of a life that was being conducted on two entirely separate tracks. Among Charlotte's most significant achievements during the Florence period was one that received very little public attention, but that mattered deeply to the practical management of the Stuart family's situation. In the course of a visit that Charlotte and Charles made to Pisa, Charlotte made a separate journey to Perugia, where Cardinal Henry was residing, to meet her uncle face to face for the first time. The encounter was important in several ways. Henry and Charlotte had dealt with each other only through correspondence and intermediaries over the previous 20 years, an exchange characterized on Henry's side by legal precision and the extraction of conditions, and on Charlotte's side by the careful management of a relationship with a powerful relative who held grudges and kept accounts. In person, things were different. Charlotte brought to the meeting a quality that her letters could only approximate, the direct, vivid presence that Hamilton's portrait captures, the intelligence and warmth and practical authority of a woman who had been managing impossible situations for a long time and had learned to do it well. Henry was a man who responded to quality when he encountered it, even if he had not always been willing to acknowledge it at a distance, and Charlotte was quality. There is no more precise word for what the sources consistently describe. She was the person in the room who understood most clearly what needed to happen, and she pursued it with a directness that Henry, whatever his private reservations, appears to have respected. She worked on the rift between the two brothers, the estrangement that had opened between Charles and Henry over the years, and that was damaging to both of them, isolating Charles in Florence and leaving Henry's dynastic duties unfulfilled. She made the case, patiently and without theatrics, for reconciliation. She arranged for the first steps in that direction to be taken. By the time she left Perugia, the ground had been prepared for an improvement in the brothers' relationship. It was a thoroughly Charlotte Stuart sort of achievement, practical, generous, motivated by a concern for the welfare of people who had not, on the whole, been particularly solicitous of her own, and it bore fruit. Over the months that followed, the relationship between Charles and Henry improved, not dramatically, not into the warmth that circumstances had long since made impossible, but into a functional communication that served both of them and served Charlotte's management of the situation she had taken on. In December of 1785, Charlotte arranged the move that she and Henry had been working toward. Charles was persuaded to leave Florence and return to Rome. The move required logistical management. Charles was not well and did not travel easily, and it required Henry's practical assistance in Rome, including his agreement to come to Florence and accompany his brother on the journey. Charlotte managed the household transition, ensured that Charles's needs during the travel were properly attended to, and arrived in Rome with her father to a welcome from Pope Pius VI that was, by the standards of what the Stuart court in exile had been receiving for years, genuinely warm. Life in Rome settled into the pattern that would define the last 2 years of Charles's life. Charlotte was his constant companion, as well as his household manager, his social secretary, and his nurse in the fullest practical sense. She managed his diet and his medication. She organized his days, the meals, the visits, the small ceremonies that gave his existence its remaining dignity. She managed his relationship with Henry, keeping the communication between the brothers open and functional. She continued her work on his drinking, and the accounts suggest that this work produced real results, that Charles, in the final 2 years of his life, consumed less alcohol than he had in the previous 30, and that this reduction was Charlotte's achievement, sustained against a strong tendency in the opposite direction. The Palazzo Muti, which had been the seat of the Stuart court in exile since James's arrival in Rome, was a residence that Charlotte knew by description and by its presence in the family mythology, but had never actually seen until she was 34 years old. She organized it, managed its staff, and received within it the small but steady stream of visitors who still came to pay their respects to the de jure King of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Some of these visitors were genuinely Jacobite loyalists, men and women for whom the Stuart cause was still a living commitment, rather than a romantic memory. Others were curious travellers, literary and artistic figures who came for the social experience of the exiled court. And others were diplomats and church officials who came out of courtesy, maintaining forms that everyone understood to be forms rather than substance. Charlotte moved among all of them with a composure and a competence that seems to have impressed everyone who recorded their impressions of her. She was the Duchess of Albany, and she filled the role, not with the showy performance of someone who needed to prove her right to it, but with the quiet authority of someone who had earned it in the hardest possible way. The visitors who left accounts of this period describe a woman of considerable personal presence, warm but not effusive, intelligent but not ostentatious, capable of managing the social demands of the role without losing sight of the practical demands that made the role sustainable. She was also, through all of this, managing her own health. The liver condition was advancing, slowly for now, but in a direction that was not reversible. The swelling that had required her clothes to be altered in Florence had not improved. There were days of pain, days of fatigue beyond what the demands of her situation would otherwise explain. She said nothing publicly about this. She was, as she had always been, capable of keeping what needed to be kept private while maintaining the appearances that the situation required. Her letters to her mother continued with their remarkable frequency. She wrote about her father, about Henry, about the daily management of the household and the people in it. She wrote about her worries for the children in Paris, for Clementina's health, for the fragility of the arrangements she had made and the uncertainty of whether they would hold. She wrote about Ferdinand. The Archbishop of Cambrai was now an important and busy man, managing a large and prestigious ecclesiastical responsibility in a France that was increasingly turbulent as the 1780s drew toward their close. Charlotte worried that the distance between them, physical, social, circumstantial, would erode what they had. She worried that the attention she could not give to the children because she was in Italy caring for a dying man was costing them something they would not easily recover. And then, in January of 1788, the end came. On the 30th of January, 1788, the same date, the same fateful 30th of January, on which his ancestor Charles I had been executed 139 years before, Charles Edward Stuart died at the Palazzo Muti. He died at night of what appears to have been a major stroke. Cardinal Henry, aware of the uncomfortable coincidence with the date of Charles I's execution, a coincidence that would have been remarked upon with varying degrees of satisfaction by those who had never wished the Stuarts well, had the official record altered to show the death as having occurred on the morning of the 31st of January. One final small deception, in service of a dignity that the world was not particularly disposed to grant. Charles was 67 years old. He had been born in Rome in December of 1720. He had lived his entire conscious life in the expectation of a restoration that never came. He had been young and beautiful and brave at 25, and had led his cause to within miles of its goal, and had failed. He had then spent 40 years becoming something considerably less than what he had been, something damaged and difficult and capable of real cruelty to those who were closest to him. And then, in the last 2 years of his life, he had been nursed by a daughter he had ignored for 23 years, who had chosen, against every reasonable expectation, to love him anyway. Charlotte was with him at the end. Cardinal Henry organized the funeral arrangements with the thoroughness and formality that the occasion required. A death mask was made. The body was embalmed and placed in a cypress wood coffin, adorned with the orders and insignia of the kingdoms that had never been his to rule. He was buried first at the Cathedral of Frascati, near Henry's episcopal residence. After Henry's own death in 1807, Charles's remains, minus his heart, which remained in Frascati, were transferred to the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican, where they lie today, alongside his father James and his brother Henry, the last 3 members of the direct male Stuart line. Charlotte was 34 years old. She had given the last 4 years of her life to her father's care, and the care had cost her enormously. In health, in proximity to her children, in the ordinary freedoms that she had never had much of, but had given up entirely in order to be here. She had reduced his drinking and improved his final years. She had reconciled him with his brother. She had managed the household with the competence and dignity that the role required. She had been with him when he died. And now, for the first time in 4 years, she was free to think about herself. It would not, as it turned out, be for very long. The Florentine period gave Charlotte something she had never had before, a context in which she was publicly visible and officially recognized. This might seem like a small thing, but for a woman who had spent 30 years living in the margins of official life, too royal to be ignored, too illegitimate to be included, it was not small at all. She had a title. She had a household. She was received at dinners and social occasions as the Duchess of Albany, the daughter of the man who had once electrified Scotland and who still, even in his diminished state, attracted a certain kind of attention from people who cared about the romantic history of the Stuart cause. She moved in the world with an authority she had never previously been permitted to exercise. This visibility also had a practical dimension that Charlotte understood and managed carefully. The Stuart court in exile was, by the 1780s, primarily a social and ceremonial institution rather than a political one. No serious person believed that Charles was going to be restored to any throne. but the court still had a presence in the world of European Catholic aristocracy, and that presence depended on its members behaving as though the form still meant something. Charlotte was very good at this. She maintained the ceremonies, kept the correspondence, ensured that Charles received visitors with appropriate dignity, and managed the small rituals of precedence and protocol that gave the exile court its continued sense of itself. She was, in effect, the prime minister of a kingdom that existed only in the minds of its inhabitants, and she discharged the role with a competence that the kingdom's subjects genuinely appreciated. She was also managing the much more difficult private work of being a daughter. The relationship between Charlotte and Charles in the Florence and Rome years was, by all accounts, genuinely affectionate. Not the stiff performance of obligation, but something warmer. He told her about the 45. He showed her the portraits, the medals, the accumulated physical evidence of the life he had led. She listened. She asked questions. She was, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, a member of his immediate family who was actually present and actually engaged with him, and he appears to have valued this enormously. The man who had ignored Charlotte for 23 years was not, in his heart, a man without the capacity for love. He had simply allowed that capacity to be overwhelmed by grief and drink and pride. Charlotte's presence in these final years gave it somewhere to go. The reunion between Charlotte and Charles in Florence in October of 1784 was observed by a small number of people whose accounts survive, and those accounts are consistent in what they report: that Charlotte was warm and capable, that Charles was emotional and occasionally confused, and that the meeting, whatever its complications, produced something that looked like genuine affection. For Charlotte, who had spent most of her life constructing a relationship with her father entirely out of paper and ink, out of letters and silences and the imagination of what the relationship might be, to be in the same room with him, to see the man rather than the myth, must have been an experience of unusual intensity. Contemporary witnesses who visited the exile court during this period left descriptions of Charlotte that are consistent with one another and that give us a surprisingly vivid picture of who she was at 30. She was tall enough to be remarked upon, in a period when women's height was more often treated as a disadvantage than an asset. She had dark colouring, the olive skin and dark hair that the portraits confirm. She had what one visitor described as a fine person, meaning a physically impressive presence, an impression of vitality and solidity. And she had, the same visitor noted, a quality of directness in her manner that was unusual, the masculine boldness of bearing that the contemporary observer meant as a description of her confidence rather than as any criticism of her femininity. She was a person who took up her appropriate space in a room and did not apologize for it. This quality of unapologetic presence is interesting in someone who had spent 24 years being denied the space she was entitled to. One might have expected, from a woman who had been effectively invisible for most of her adult life, a greater degree of diffidence, a more apologetic quality of manner. Charlotte had none of it. She arrived in Florence as herself, competent, warm, direct, fully inhabiting the role she had been given. And she seems to have done so without the nervousness or self-consciousness that the circumstances might have produced in someone of less inner stability. The convent years had given her many things. Among them, perhaps, was the particular steadiness that comes from having been forced, over a very long time, to be sufficient to herself. The months following Charles's death found Charlotte in a situation that was, outwardly, improved from anything she had known before. She was the Duchess of Albany, an acknowledged title, recognized by the Pope. The French court had awarded her a pension of 20,000 livres, In acknowledgement of her position as her father's heir, she had inherited the majority of his remaining estate, the furnishings of the Florentine residence, the personal papers of the Stuart court, various items of property that she converted to liquid funds through the sale of the palazzo and its contents. She was, by the standards of her adult life, relatively well provided for. She was also, as she had been for most of her adult life, not well. The liver condition that had been advancing quietly through her body for more than a decade was now making itself felt in ways that were harder to manage or disguise. The swelling that had first required her to have her clothes altered in 1784 had not improved. There was pain, particularly, the sources suggest, when breathing, which points to the kind of pressure on adjacent structures that advancing liver disease produces. There was fatigue beyond what her duties alone would have caused. She was aware that she was not recovering from whatever had been wrong with her for years, but she continued to function, to appear, to maintain the correspondences and relationships that sustained her position and her family's welfare. She spent the months immediately after Charles's death primarily in the company of Cardinal Henry. The relationship between them had become, through the years of Charlotte's Italian residence, genuinely warm. Warmer, certainly, than Henry's earlier dealings with her situation would have suggested was possible. He had come to appreciate what Charlotte was, her intelligence, her practical capacity, her grace under conditions that would have broken most people. He valued her company, and she valued his. He was a man of faith and intellectual rigor, and in the world of the Exile Stuart court, those qualities were not common. She received visitors, maintained her social duties as the Duchess of Albany, and wrote to her mother with the frequency that had characterized her correspondence throughout the Italian years. The letters from this period reveal a woman who was thinking about the future, specifically, the futures of the people she would leave behind if her health continued to deteriorate. She wrote about the children, using the careful oblique language she had always used when referring to them. She wrote about Clementina, who was now an old woman, somewhere in her late 60s, managing 3 grandchildren in Paris, whose identities she could tell no one. She wrote about her own fear that she would not have sufficient time to make the arrangements she needed to make. In the spring and summer of 1789, she began to travel in search of health. She went to Nocera in Umbria, where the mineral waters had a local reputation for restorative properties, and she spent time there hoping for improvement that did not come. She went to Bologna, seeking the attention of physicians in a city with a long medical tradition. The University of Bologna was among the oldest in Europe, and its doctors were regarded as skilled. The physicians she consulted could offer limited assistance. Liver cancer, which is, in retrospect, almost certainly what was advancing through Charlotte's body, was beyond the reach of 18th century medicine to arrest or reverse. The doctors could identify obstruction of the liver, they could manage some of the symptoms, and they could do little else. Charlotte was staying in Bologna as the guest of the Marchesa Giulia Lambertini Bovio at the Palazzo Visani Sanguinetti, a woman of the Bolognese nobility connected to one of the city's most distinguished families, and a friend of Charlotte's who had offered her household as a residence during this period of illness and treatment. Charlotte was in comfortable physical circumstances, surrounded by people who cared for her and who managed her comfort with the attention she could no longer manage for herself. As the disease advanced, she was also writing, still sending letters to Paris, still asking after the children and after her mother with the persistence that had characterized her correspondence for 20 years. She composed her will on the 14th of November, 1789. She was 36 years old, and she was making the calculations that people make when they know the end is near and want to be certain that what they can control has been properly arranged. The will was clear and methodical. It left her mother a lump sum of 50,000 livres and an annual income of 15,000 livres, a provision that would give Clementina, for the first time in many years, genuine financial security for the remainder of her life. It left instructions that this income should support her necessitous relations, the careful, indirect phrase that was understood by those who needed to understand it to mean Charlotte's 3 hidden children, but that left no explicit record for anyone who might later look for one. Her personal possessions and jewels went to Cardinal Henry, as Charlotte had arranged with him. Ferdinand de Rohan was not mentioned in the will. The children were not mentioned by name. The secret she had maintained for 15 years would be maintained a little longer. On the 17th of November, 1789, Charlotte Stuart died. She died at the Palazzo Vizzani Sanguinetti in Bologna, in the room and the care of the Marchesa, who had taken her in. She was 36 years old. Her death was recorded as resulting from obstruction of the liver, the medical language of the period for the hepatocellular carcinoma that had been progressing through her body for over a decade. She had survived her father by 22 months. She had not seen her children since she left Paris in the summer of 1784, 5 years before. She had not seen her mother. Cardinal Henry, when the news reached him, arranged a memorial service at Frascati and travelled personally to Bologna to pray at Charlotte's graveside. It was a gesture of genuine mourning. He had not always treated Charlotte as well as she deserved. He had been cold and legalistic at the beginning, had contested her legitimization and extracted her mother's statement, and held back the inheritance for 2 years before releasing it under conditions. But he had also come, through the years of proximity, to understand what Charlotte was, and his grief at her death appears to have been real. He held the 50,000 livres and the 15,000 annual income that Charlotte had left to Clementina for 2 full years before releasing them. When he did release the inheritance, it was on the condition that Clementina sign a formal legal renunciation, a quittance, on behalf of herself and her descendants, relinquishing any further claim against the Stuart estate. It was the same instinct that had led him, 30 years earlier, to demand a statement from Clementina in exchange for the 5,000 livre allowance, the forms of generosity observed, the substance conditional on legal closure. Clementina signed, as she had signed the first time. She was very old, she needed the money, and she had learned, through a lifetime of dealing with the Stuart family's official representatives, that the dignified course of action was not always the available one. Charlotte was buried at the church of San Biagio in Bologna, as she had requested. The church no longer stands. It was demolished by the French Revolutionary forces in 1797, only 8 years after Charlotte's burial there. Her remains were believed to have been moved to the Oratorio della Santissima Trinità in Bologna, and subsequently to the nearby Chiesa della Santissima Trinità when the oratorio closed. Whether the transfers were properly carried out, whether Charlotte's remains genuinely rest in the Chiesa della Santissima Trinità today, is uncertain. Her monument stands there. Where she herself may be is not definitively known. It is a fitting, if melancholy, epilogue for a woman who spent most of her life without a fixed home. The transition from caring for a dying father to managing one's own death is one of the hardest that human beings face, and Charlotte was facing it at 34, without the support of the people she most loved, and with the added weight of knowing that her own unfinished business, the children who did not know who they were, the arrangements that had not yet been fully secured, was still incomplete. She had done what she had come to Italy to do. She had been with her father at the end. But the end of his story was not the end of hers, and the story that remained was one she had very little time to finish. The pension from France, 20,000 livres annually, was real and useful, but it represented a modest provision for a woman of her position, particularly one who had obligations she could not discuss publicly. Charlotte managed the money carefully, as she had managed everything carefully throughout her adult life. The proceeds from the sale of the Florentine palazzo and its contents went to augment the pension, and the combined resources were sufficient to allow her to travel in reasonable comfort, while also maintaining the provision to Paris that her mother and children required. But sufficiency, in Charlotte's situation, was always precarious. There was no margin for unexpected expenses, no cushion against the sudden deterioration of her health that might require extended medical attention. The medical attention she received in Bologna was the best available, and it was insufficient. The physicians she consulted, men trained in the traditions of the University of Bologna, the oldest medical school in Europe, a place of genuine learning and considerable clinical experience, could identify what was happening. They could manage some of the more painful symptoms. They could offer spa treatments and dietary modifications and the other interventions that the medical knowledge of the period made available. What they could not do was arrest the underlying process. The liver cancer that was advancing through Charlotte's body did not respond to anything that the 18th century had to offer, and the physicians, however skilled, were working with tools that were simply not equal to the task. She was dying, and she knew it, and she managed that knowledge with the same quality of quiet competence that she had brought to everything else in her life. She wrote to her mother. She wrote to Henry. She wrote to Ferdinand. The letters to Ferdinand do not survive in the same way that the letters to Clementina do, and what was said between them in those final months we cannot know with any certainty. But she was writing, and in the writing, she was doing what she had always done, maintaining connection across distance, keeping the lines open between the people she loved and the world that was about to close around her. The will she composed 3 days before her death was the final act of the practical intelligence that had sustained her throughout. It was clear. It was fair. It provided for her mother in a way that Clementina's position required and deserved. It protected the children through the oblique reference to necessitous relations that those who needed to understand would understand. It left the physical possessions to Henry, who had the rank and the institutional resources to preserve them in a way that Charlotte, in the last months of her life conducted largely in borrowed rooms, could not. It was, in its compression and its care, a document that reflected the person who wrote it, someone who had learned to accomplish a great deal with very little, and who did not waste the limited time she had. In the months following Charlotte's death, the world settled back into the understanding of the Stuart dynasty that had prevailed for some years, the understanding that the direct line was ending, that the last chapters were being written, that what remained was an aging Cardinal in Frascati, and the long, slow close of one of history's most romantic failures. Clementina, in Paris, knew differently, but Clementina said nothing to anyone who did not already know. She was in her late 60s by the time Charlotte died, a remarkable age for the period, and still several years short of the end of her life. She was managing 3 children in Paris who could not be told the full truth of who they were, or if told, could not be permitted to speak of it. The eldest daughter, Charlotte Maximilienne Amélie, was approaching 20 years of age. The second daughter, Victoire Adelaide, was perhaps 10 or 11. The boy, Charles Edward, baptized as Rohenstadt, the compound of the 2 family names, was 5 years old. Clementina raised them with the quietness and the discipline of a woman who understood that their safety depended on remaining invisible. And they remained invisible. The children grew up in the anonymity that Charlotte had established for them and Clementina maintained. They were educated. They were cared for. They were, in all the ways that mattered for their immediate welfare, managed well. But they grew up without the history that was their birthright, without the knowledge that the blood they carried was the blood of kings, that their mother had been the Duchess of Albany, that their grandfather was the man whose name still stirred something in the hearts of Scots wherever they lived in the world. That knowledge was kept from them, or kept carefully controlled, for reasons that were entirely understandable and entirely, for those children, costly. The eldest daughter, Charlotte Maximilienne Amélie, was placed eventually in the care of Thomas Coutts, the distinguished London banker who had distant family connections to the Walkinshaws. She moved in the modest social circles that her circumstances permitted, and in August of 1804 she married in Paris. Her husband was Jean-Louis de la Morlière. Her brother Charles, now 20 years old, and known by this time as Count Rohenstadt, stood as a witness at the ceremony, one of the few documented occasions on which two of Charlotte's children appear together in the historical record. The marriage was unremarkable in its social dimensions, a middle-class alliance, far removed from the royal courts from which Charlotte Maximilian had descended. Less than 2 years later, in 1806, she died in childbirth. Her child was stillborn. She was perhaps 26 years old. The second daughter, Victoire Adelaide, took a longer and quieter path. She married, in 1804, a military doctor named Pierre-Joseph Marie de Saint-Ursin. Another modest alliance, another life lived below the level of visibility that her actual ancestry might have commanded. They had a son together, born in Paris in 1809, named Théodore Marie de Saint-Ursin. The boy studied for the priesthood at the seminary of Saint-Sulpice, was ordained a deacon, and died in 1838 at 29, a young man who went to his grave without knowing the full story of who he was. After her first husband's death, Victoire Adelaide married again, a naval officer, and died eventually at Nice in March of 1871. She was perhaps in her early 90s, an extraordinary age, and she took her secret with her, as her mother had taken hers. Whether Victoire Adelaide left living descendants is the question around which a significant scholarly controversy has developed in the early 21st century. In 2001, a Polish aristocrat named Peter Paniński published a book arguing that a daughter of Charlotte's, travelling under the name Marie Victoire de Rohan during the revolutionary disruptions of the 1790s, had gone to Poland and there married a Polish nobleman named Paul Antony Louis Bertrand de Nikorowicz. This woman, Paniński argued, was the ancestor from whom he himself descended, through a chain of marriages and births that he traced through the genealogical records of Polish noble families. If Paniński is right, then the direct blood of the Stuart pretenders did not end with Cardinal Henry, or with Count Rohenstadt, but continued through a Polish noble family into the present day, with living descendants who carry the genetic heritage of James II of England and his successors. The argument has been vigorously contested by the genealogist Marie-Louise Backhurst, whose research published between 2013 and 2023 raises substantial objections to the identification that Paniński's case depends on. Backhurst argues that the woman Paniński identifies as his ancestor was not Charlotte's daughter, but another woman of the Rohan family with a similar name, and that the evidence marshalled for the identification is circumstantial and, in some key respects, not supported by the surviving documentation. Paniński has responded to each point, maintaining his position and presenting additional evidence in its support. The debate is ongoing, highly technical, and far from concluded. What it demonstrates, above everything else, is that Charlotte's secret was so completely kept that even the most determined modern investigators, with the resources of 21st century genealogical research at their disposal, cannot fully resolve what she managed to conceal entirely. Charlotte's son, Count Rohenstadt, Charles Edward Augustus Maximilian Stuart, baptized under his fictional name in 1784, grew into the most adventurous and in some ways the most poignant of the three children. Educated by Ferdinand de Rohan's family connections in Germany, he emerged into adult life as a man of considerable energy and wide-ranging capability. He served as an officer in the Russian army. He held the rank of general in the Austrian service. He travelled to India, to the Americas, to the West Indies. A man of the long 19th century in its fullest sense, moving through a world that was reshaping itself in the aftermath of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic upheaval, adapting to whatever it offered. And as he grew older, he began to speak. He told people, at first quietly and then more openly, who he was. He was the son of Charlotte Stuart, Duchess of Albany, the acknowledged daughter of Charles Edward Stuart. He was the grandson of Bonnie Prince Charlie. He invited people to look at the name he carried, Rohenstadt, Rohan and Stuart, compressed into a single word, and to understand what it said. He had legitimate documents from his baptism in Paris, legitimate letters connecting him to the Stuart family correspondence, legitimate evidence that he was precisely who he claimed to be. Most people did not believe him. He was, to the world at large, another romantic adventurer with an implausible royal claim, the sort of figure who appeared periodically in the drawing rooms and courts of Europe, charming and persistent and not quite credible. The Hanoverian authorities, when they heard of his claims in 1817, briefly detained him in a gesture that suggests they were not entirely comfortable dismissing him. But nothing further came of the detention. He made an unsuccessful attempt to pursue a claim in London against the dowry of Queen Mary of Modena, his great-great-grandmother, and that too came to nothing. The world was not interested in revisiting the Stuart question. He came to Scotland in 1816, and whatever he felt standing in the country where his grandfather's cause had burned and died, standing perhaps near the moorland of Culloden, or in the highland landscapes that had sheltered Charles Edward during his long flight, he left no record of it beyond the fact of the visit itself. He married twice, but both marriages were childless. When he died in October of 1854, in a coaching accident near Dunkeld, when a wheel came off the vehicle and it overturned, he left no direct heirs. He was buried at Dunkeld Cathedral in the soil of Scotland. The stone can still be seen. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most remarkable graves in Britain, the resting place of the secret grandson of Bonnie Prince Charlie, a man who carried a dynasty's ending inside him for 70 years and told whoever would listen, and died in a ditch near Stirling, not entirely unlike the cause he had been born from. Clementina Walkinshaw died in Fribourg, in Switzerland, in 1802. She was somewhere in her early 80s, which made her, for her era, an old woman of remarkable longevity. She had outlived Charles Edward Stuart, who died in 1788. She had outlived Charlotte, who died in 1789. She had outlived the French Ancien Régime that had been the framework of her adult life, the Jacobite court that had been the context of her early connection to Charles, and most of the world that had shaped her. She died having kept the secret of 3 children raised under false names, the grandchildren of a famous prince, hidden from history for reasons that made complete sense and cost those children enormously. The world believed, for the next century and a half, that the direct Stuart line had ended with Cardinal Henry's death in 1807. Then, In the 1950s, the historians Alasdair and Hetty Taylor began to read Charlotte's letters. They were looking, as historians do, for the shapes that documents make when they are trying to say something they cannot say directly. And in Charlotte's 100-per-year correspondence with her mother, in the careful oblique references, the indirect concerns, the persistent attention to people whose identities were always just out of frame, they found the shape of 3 children who had been hidden for 150 years. The great secret of the Stuart dynasty, that Bonnie Prince Charlie had grandchildren, that his blood continued beyond where everyone thought it ended, that the story of the last Stuarts was richer and stranger than anyone had realized, was cracked open at last by the most ordinary evidence in the world, a mother's letters home. The France into which Charlotte's children had been born and raised was, by the 1790s, a France that barely resembled the country of their childhood. The revolution that had begun in 1789, the same year Charlotte died, had dismantled the Ancien Régime with a thoroughness that went beyond political change into something more fundamental, a reordering of the social categories through which people understood themselves and were understood by others, the aristocracy on which Charlotte's world had depended, the titled families, the church hierarchy, the elaborate structure of inherited privilege, was being systematically stripped of its power and in many cases of its members' lives. Ferdinand de Rohan, Archbishop of Cambrai, spent the 1790s navigating the dangerous waters of the revolutionary period with varying degrees of success. His elevated ecclesiastical position was simultaneously a source of protection. The church was too large and too embedded to be entirely abolished at once, and a source of danger. He survived, which was not guaranteed. Charlotte's children survived as well, aided by the very anonymity that had been imposed on them for protective reasons entirely different from those that were now operative. They were not known as Stuart descendants. They were not known as Rohan children. They were obscure private individuals with no documented claim on the attention of the revolutionary authorities. The false identities that Charlotte had arranged for them, the fictional parentage, the borrowed surnames, which had been designed to protect them from the consequences of their royal blood, in a Hanoverian world, now protected them equally well from the consequences of their aristocratic blood in a revolutionary one. The concealment worked double duty. The very thoroughness with which Charlotte had hidden her children kept them safe through the upheaval that consumed so many of the people and institutions of her world. The scholarly work that eventually uncovered their existence in the 1950s was painstaking and required the combination of archival research across multiple countries, the reading of private correspondence in several languages, and the patient construction of genealogical chains from fragmentary evidence. Alasdair and Hetty Taylor were working in the tradition of British historical scholarship that took seriously the obligation to document what had actually happened, rather than what the official records suggested had happened, and their work opened a door that had been closed for a century and a half. Subsequent scholars, Barbara Tsakurgis, Peter Beninsky, Marie-Louise Backhurst, and others, have pushed further into the questions the Taylors identified, with results that have sometimes confirmed the outlines they established and sometimes complicated them significantly. The debate about Victoire Adélaïde and the possible Polish descendants is unlikely to be fully resolved without the emergence of new documentation. Documents from Polish archives, private family papers, church records that may or may not have survived the disruptions of 2 world wars. The 20th century was not kind to the archives of Central and Eastern Europe, and the records that might settle the question definitively may have been destroyed. What we can say with confidence is that Charlotte Stuart had children, that those children lived and moved through the world, and that the Stuart blood, that the Jacobite cause had spent a century trying to put on the British throne, continued in those children and in their descendants, somewhere, in some form, for at least another generation. It is a fitting irony that the dynasty whose most famous member spent his life trying to make a public claim succeeded only in making a private one. Bonnie Prince Charlie did not recover his grandfather's throne. He did not receive the recognition he believed was his by blood, but he left through the daughter he ignored for 23 years and through the secret she kept from him, a continuation that the official story did not record. The Stuarts survived in the hidden way that things survive when the front door has been closed against them. They went underground, took other names, lived other lives, and in the archives, patiently waiting for someone to read them, they left behind the evidence. There is a poem that Robert Burns wrote for Charlotte Stuart, most probably around the time of her death in 1789, when the news would have reached Scotland through the networks of Jacobite connection and Scottish-French correspondence that kept the memory of the cause alive. Burns called it the Bonnie Lass of Albany, and it is a lament, not an angry one, not a political one, but a quiet and aching one in the tradition of the Scottish poetry that knew how to hold grief with restraint and beauty simultaneously. Burns was, by his own account, genuinely fascinated by Charlotte's story. He wrote to a friend that he had been thinking of naming one of his own illegitimate children after her, a gesture that speaks to how clearly he understood the parallels between her situation and his own. Both were people for whom the gap between the inner life and the officially permissible life was a defining experience. Both had produced children whose legitimacy was complicated by the social forms their world imposed. Both understood, from the inside, what it meant to live in the space between what you were and what you were allowed to be. His poem presents Charlotte not as a defeated figure or a tragic one in the grand operatic sense, but as a woman who has been wronged, quietly, persistently, in ways that the world did not always notice, but that she felt every day. In the poem, she is royal blood that has been mistreated, a dignity that has been denied its proper acknowledgement. The wrong done to her is not spectacular. It is the ordinary wrong of neglect, of refusal, of a father who had everything she needed and chose, for decades, not to give it. Burns understood that kind of wrong, and he gave it words that have outlasted most of the other records of Charlotte's existence. In his poem, she is the Bonnie Lass of Albany, not Albany in the grand sense of the ducal title, but Albany in the older sense, the Latin name for Scotland, the homeland she had never seen and that had never known her. She was the daughter of Scotland's prince, and Scotland did not know she existed until a poet noticed her absence and wrote a lament for it. The life that Charlotte Stuart actually lived, not the legend, not the romantic story, but the actual texture of it, was a life of remarkable endurance and a remarkable quality of grace. She spent the first 7 years of her life in an unstable household defined by a father's violence and a mother's fear. She spent the next 24 years in French convents, dependent on grudging charity, writing letters that went unanswered. She conducted a long secret relationship with an archbishop, bore 3 children whom she could not acknowledge, and managed the concealment of their existence with a thoroughness that held for nearly 2 centuries. She nursed her difficult, damaged father through his final years, reduced his drinking, managed his household, reconciled him with his brother, and was with him when he died. And then she died herself, at 36, of a cancer that had been growing in her body for over a decade. What drove her? It is a question worth sitting with for a moment, because the answer is not obvious. She had been given so little acknowledgement, so little provision, so little of the consideration that her birth should have entitled her to, that a more calculating or a more bitter person might have looked at what was available and decided it was not worth the effort. The letters she wrote across 24 years of silence could have stopped. The forgiveness she extended to her father when he finally called for her could have been withheld or made conditional. The care she gave him in Florence and Rome could have been managed at arm's length, without the genuine personal engagement that the sources consistently describe. But Charlotte did not do any of those things. She wrote the letters. She went to Florence. She looked at the broken old man who had failed her for the first 30 years of her life and chose to love him anyway. The quality this reflects, the quality that the sources keep circling around but never quite name, is perhaps something like faithfulness. A faithfulness not to a person who had earned it, but to a set of commitments that Charlotte had made in some interior part of herself, long before she had any reason to believe they would ever be honored. She was faithful to the relationship, even when the relationship had given her nothing. She was faithful to her mother, who had given her everything. She was faithful to her children, whom she protected even when she could not be with them. And she was faithful, in the end, to herself, to the person she had decided to be, the person who did not make her suffering into a reason for cruelty toward others. The dynasty she was born into had spent nearly a century chasing a crown it never recovered. The father she spent her life trying to reach had been a hero in his youth and a failure in his age. The children she hid from the world grew up in anonymity, their line dispersing into the broader population of 19th century Europe, their true history unavailable to them until historians began to look closely in the middle of the 20th century. The church in which she was buried was demolished 8 years after her death, and her remains may or may not have been properly transferred, and no one can say with certainty today where Charlotte Stuart rests, but she rests wherever she is, as someone who earned the rest. She came into the world in a Liège room in October of 1753, the inconvenient offspring of a man who called her cheild and refused to acknowledge her. She left it in a Bologna palazzo in November of 1789, having given everything she had to the people she loved, having kept the secrets that needed keeping, having done with the life available to her something that a life with far more resources might not have managed. She was the last daughter of the Jacobite cause. She was the bonny lass of Albany, and she deserved far more than the world gave her. Burns's poem ends with a kind of defiance, not a loud or political defiance, but the quiet insistence that the wrong done to Charlotte be remembered, that the woman who was overlooked in her own time not be overlooked by the time that follows. That insistence is the right one. Charlotte Stuart was worth knowing. Her story is worth knowing. And the fact that it took 200 years to fully recover does not diminish it. If anything, the recovery is part of the story. The letters that preserved the secret of her children were the same letters that eventually revealed them. The woman who wrote 100 letters a year to maintain the connections she was separated from also wrote, in those letters, the evidence that would eventually tell the truth. Charlotte Stuart was, among everything else, a writer, and in the end, the writing won. For it is a truth about history that the things people try to hide sometimes preserve themselves in the very acts of hiding. Every careful oblique reference Charlotte made to her necessitous relations in her will, every letter she wrote to Clementina asking after children she could not name, every precaution she took that left a partial trace in a baptismal register or a property record or an intermediary's account, all of these were also, in their way, acts of survival. She was hiding her children from the world as it existed in her lifetime, but she was leaving them, in the gaps between the carefully chosen words, for the world that would come after. The world that came after found them. Not completely. The scholarly debate about Victoire Adelaide and her possible Polish descendants continues. Not neatly. The records are partial. The chains of evidence have missing links. The history of 3 children raised under false names in revolutionary France does not resolve into clean certainty, but well enough to know that Charlotte Stuart existed, that she loved and was loved, that she left behind her 3 children who grew and moved through the world and carried in them the last traces of the blood that had once sat on the thrones of England and Scotland, well enough to know that the story did not end where it appeared to end. The world Charlotte was born into, the world of the Jacobite courts in exile, of Catholicism as a political allegiance as much as a faith, of dynasties that maintained their claims across generations of dispossession, was swept away by the French Revolution and the upheaval that followed it. The France in which she had spent most of her life, the France of convents and aristocratic privilege, and the elaborate social hierarchies of the Ancien Régime, ceased to exist in the years immediately following her death. Ferdinand de Rohan survived the revolution, his status protecting him enough to continue, though not without difficulty, into the 19th century. He died in 1813 at 74, having outlived Charlotte by 24 years. Their story, the Archbishop and the illegitimate Duchess, the secret children in Paris, was as thoroughly hidden from the revolutionary world as it had been from the Ancien Régime world. The revolution did not know about it. Neither did anyone else, for a very long time. And Clementina Walkinshaw, the woman who had started everything, who had been a Jacobite girl at Bannockburn in January of 1746, and had ended as an 80-year-old in Fribourg in 1802, having lived through the entire arc of the story, carried her knowledge with her to the grave. She had been the first person to make the sacrifice that this family required, the sacrifice of leaving safety for love, and then the sacrifice of leaving love for survival. She had protected Charlotte in 1760 by leaving. She had protected Charlotte's children in the 1790s by remaining silent. She was the quiet spine of the entire story, not famous, not celebrated, not even properly visible in the historical record. And without her, nothing would have survived. Tonight, as the lights are low and the world outside has gone quiet, we leave Charlotte Stuart in the place where the story settles, not on a throne or a battlefield, not in any of the dramatic locations that history tends to favor, but in the ordinary spaces of a human life lived with extraordinary integrity. We leave her writing letters that may or may not be answered. We leave her in a borrowed room in Bologna, with her faith intact and her secrets kept, and her children somewhere she cannot reach. We leave her with Burns's words at her side, the gentle insistence of a poet who saw in her story something that deserved to be remembered. She was the forgotten duchess. She was the loyal child. She was the keeper of secrets. She was the woman who wrote 100 letters a year to hold together what the world kept trying to separate. She was the daughter who came when she was called, long after she had any obligation to come. She was 36 years old when she died, and she had lived more and loved more and lost more than most people manage in twice the time. Sleep well, and thank you from all of us at Sleepy Crown Reborn for spending this night with Charlotte Stuart, the illegitimate daughter who claimed royal blood, the last bloom of the Jacobite cause, and one of the most quietly remarkable women of the 18th century. This has been Sleepy Crown Reborn. We will see you next time.